True love or just a conspiracy? Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. So I have one of my most requested video topics today. I was kind of overwhelmed recently at how many people were requesting that I talk about this topic, and that is to analyze the relationship between Candace Owens and her husband George Farmer. I was getting like comments, I was getting like private DMs of people sending me clips of them like, we need you to analyze their relationship, and it seemed like the overwhelming feeling that I was getting from a lot of these comments and a lot of these requests was people saying that there was something off about their relationship, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. And I gotta be honest, after doing my research on their relationship, I agree. Something is off, but this is just an analysis of the relationship between Candace Owens and her husband, George Farmer. Before I get into this, a few disclaimers. For one, like I say in all my videos, I don't know them, okay? I don't know the people I'm talking about in this video. I don't know them personally. My guess is probably most of you don't either. So I am just analyzing them and their relationship and their dynamic based on what is public information for everybody. I do not know what they're like behind closed doors. This is literally just an analysis of their public personas and their public images, so we can learn from what we see of their relationship publicly, so we can take some of those lessons into our everyday life, so we can have happier, healthier lives and relationships. I will also make a note when talking about Candace Owens, which if you aren't familiar, she's a content creator, political primarily content creator. She's been very much in the news publicly. You can look her up. She's pretty much everywhere. Very opinionated, very polarizing. And she is married to George Farmer, who is a British aristocrat, I'll put it that way. Comes from a family of a lot of money and a lot of prestige. And they've been married for, I want to say 4 years now. I don't know the exact numbers, that's not really relevant. They have 3 children together. Candace Owens is very much public, whereas her husband George is a more private person that kind of like operates behind the scenes. And I want to make a note when analyzing their relationship, and one of the reasons why I think some people may be seeing that something is off, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt in this situation. It does appear like George Farmer is not someone who is super comfortable in front of the camera or sort of in a public space. He seems much more introverted and somebody who really doesn't like to be seen in the public eye a lot. Like, he's just a little bit more reserved in that way. And Candace Owens is much more outgoing and likes to be, you know, in front of the camera and is more outspoken and things like that. And I say that in a completely non-judgmental way. That just seems to be their personalities. And there's nothing right or wrong with either of those personalities. It just is difficult to truly get an analysis of their relationship when they are in front of the camera, because there's kind of a sense that George is not comfortable in front of the camera. So, you know, like the subject is always affected by knowing that they're being watched. George does seem a little bit less comfortable because the cameras are around him, and I think some people might be picking up that he is uncomfortable when talking to her, which I think we have to kind of factor in the fact that he may and seems likely to be uncomfortable being on camera. So I want to make that as a note, because like there's nothing wrong with not wanting to be, you know, public and seen in front of the camera and being more introverted. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is going to affect how your interactions are perceived when you are in front of a camera because of, you know, that discomfort. So I want to kind of just give them the benefit of the doubt in that sense. There's also a cultural difference where, you know, Candace Owens is very American, she's very loud, very boisterous, and George Farmer is very British, so he has a sort of like dry British wit. He's a little bit more aloof. That's just, some of that is personality, some of that's cultural. You know, I want to factor that in as well. And I also want to make a note that, you know, I know that Candace Owens is a very polarizing figure. She has pissed off a lot of people, and she also has some like rabid supporters. I'm making this video because it was highly requested, but I'm not making this video as like a hit piece on her. Honestly, I don't watch a ton of Candace Owens's content. I watched more of it in preparation for this video, more than I think I would like to have watched. I watched her interview that she did specifically with George Farmer, and I watched some of his interviews that he has done with other people, because he doesn't do a ton of interviews. I also watched one of Candace Owens's full interviews with Andrew Tate, and then part of another one because I could only find part of it online. I think one of her interviews that she did with him, I think has been removed, or maybe she moved it, maybe it's behind a paywall, I don't know. So I've kind of watched like 2 interviews that Candace Owens has done with Andrew Tate, because Andrew Tate does factor into her connection to George Farmer, which I'll get into, but I wanted to get a sense of like Candace Owens' interaction with somebody else, and particularly with Andrew Tate, because he is connected to George Farmer. And then I watched a recent interview that Candace Owens did with Piers Morgan, because I kind of wanted to get a sense of her interaction with somebody else. And I think, you know, Piers Morgan also being British, I think gave me a nice little, like, it was just kind of to get a sense, because I've mostly seen like little clips of Candace Owens, and you can't always get the full sense of a person just from little tiny clips. She has so much content online, so it was hard to really get like a full sense of everything she's said before. But I did want to kind of get a sense of like how she is with George, and then also comparing it to how she is with other people, particularly someone like an Andrew Tate or things like that, because I kind of want to get a little bit more of a baseline for her interactions with people. So I have watched more Andrew Tate content recently in the past few days than I have ever. You're welcome, I did this for you. That was rough. But anyway, I haven't really like watched her content, you know, really consistently, but over time when I have heard her content, you know, full disclosure, there's sometimes she says things that I very much agree with, and other times she says things that I absolutely disagree with. I'm not making this video as some kind of like a hit piece to take her down or call her out or, you know, bash her, trash her, or anything like that. That's not my intention. Her content has got very rage baity, which I understand to a certain extent why so many content creators are going for rage bait, because that's what gets clicks and views, and that's what gets the conversation going, and that's what gets people talked about. It's almost like people are constantly doing a publicity stunt, and I'm not a big fan of that kind of content, but I understand why people are drawn to doing it, because that's what gets clicks and views nowadays. I don't like that the system is set up that way, but that is how the system works, you know? And I think that that gets into one of my first reasons why I think people are seeing Candace Owens and her husband's relationship as being, they can't pinpoint what's off about it. And I think it goes into a fundamental idea that Candace Owens, in my observation, in the span of just the content that I've seen of her, my sense of her content is it feels inauthentic. She has mentioned at times that, like, you know, she was more liberal when she was younger, and she looks back on some of her, you know, her old self, and she's like embarrassed by some of the things that she said in the past because she's grown and evolved, and more power to her for that. I think at the end of the day, I think if you're not growing and evolving, and if your opinions are never kind of shifting as you become more educated about, you know, life, and as you have more life experience and things like that, like, I think it's normal for and healthy for people to kind of grow and evolve their perspectives on life. So I would not judge anybody. I don't think that, you know, you have an opinion when you're 20 and you change your opinion when you're 30. I don't think that means that you're wishy-washy or anything. However, if you're somebody whose opinion is always shifting, and you're kind of always kind of like, ooh, that opinion that I had 5 minutes ago, well, I'm gonna say this other thing that contradicts that opinion, and you kind of get very hypocritical, you get a little wish-washy. I know for me, like, I get like alarm bells that go off, like, ooh, this feels inauthentic. And I think for a lot of people that happens, but a lot of people, I think, aren't trusting their intuition, so they're just like, this feels off and I don't know why. And it's because you may not necessarily disagree with what that person is saying in that moment, but you're like, if you know that that person has relatively recently said something that contradicts it, you're gonna get an alarm bell that goes off. It's like, okay, I agree with what they're saying, but like, why do I feel like I still can't trust them? Or why does this feel off to me? I get that feeling personally with a Candace Owens, where even at times when she's saying something that I agree with, I'm often like, why does this feel off to me? And I think it's because she has said other things that contradict that. It starts to get you questioning the person's stability, which I think is a big factor. When you are looking to somebody to see if they're trustworthy, you want to see stability. Like, people that are unstable don't feel trustworthy. So if you feel like somebody seems to be really kind of wish-washy, it feels unstable, and you're not going to feel like you trust them. So one of the things that is kind of a pet peeve of mine in today's society is, it frustrates me because, as many of you know, and many of you have maybe found my content because I talk about masculine and feminine energies, and I feel like people are really starting to turn against the idea of masculine and feminine energies. And that frustrates me because I think the reason a lot of people are doing that is because they're falling into the trap that unfortunately a lot of, I would say, like red pill manosphere creators are, that masculine and feminine energies fit into this very narrow-minded stereotype, stereotypical masculine things and stereotypical feminine things. And when I talk about masculine and feminine energies, I'm talking more about kind of like the yin and the yang, you know, the opposite polarities. It's an energetic thing, and it's not like, okay, because this guy drives a truck and owns a gun, he's masculine, and because this girl, you know, wears a dress and pretty bows and bakes, she's automatically feminine. Like, you can do either of those things and be embodied in your masculine or feminine energy. So it's kind of one of my pet peeves when I see content creators that start talking about masculine and feminine energies and talk about being masculine or being feminine or masculinity or femininity or things like that, and they equate it to these sort of like gender stereotypes, because the energies have nothing to do with that. One of the things that bugs me that came up a lot in one of Candace Owens' interviews with Andrew Tate was a lot of homophobic rhetoric and stuff, which bothered me a lot, in this kind of touting of masculinity and then accusing men that weren't as masculine of being like straight homosexuals, was her wording, which drives me crazy, because like, I've known full-on gay men in full drag that have embodied masculine energy better than some macho men. Not all the time, obviously, but like, I've seen the spectrum, you know what I mean? Like, I've seen the absolute spectrum. I've seen some women who were the butchest lesbians I've ever seen, who embodied a lot more feminine energy than some of these like girly girl types and stuff. Like, and I've seen in reverse. Like, some of these things, these like stereotypes and stuff that we have, aren't really true masculine and feminine energies. And Candace Owens is not the only person that does this by any means, but I do feel like a lot of her content does kind of stereotype that, and it bugs me, because I do feel like it really does turn people off from the concept of masculine and feminine energies, because they start associating it with gender stereotypes that really have nothing to do with it, you know what I mean? That is something that kind of bugs me about her content, full disclosure. The thing about Candace Owens and her content is, Candace Owens is very masculine in her public persona, in her professional life. She's a very, very masculine woman. And I say this not as a judgment, because I don't think there's anything wrong with a woman embodying a lot of masculine energy, particularly in her professional life. In fact, in most professions and most careers, it's necessary. Like, that's just the world that we have, that we've set up, that we live in. So I don't say this to judge or shame her for that or anything. It's just that she does embody a lot of masculine energy in her professional life. In subtle ways, she's confirmed that. In like simple terms, let's simplify it. Masculine is the mind, the feminine is the body. So the masculine is like the thinking, the rational mind. The feminine is the body, which is more of like the feeling and the emotion. Neither one is right or wrong. And one of my issues with a lot of the masculinity manosphere content is, like, they complain that women aren't feminine, but then they shame feelings and emotions and intuition. Like, they shame the things that make women feminine. And they promote this idea that, like, masculinity is better because it's the mind and it's the rational. And masculinity is better and femininity is wrong and it's bad and it's weak, and it's like they trash it. But then they're like, but why aren't women more feminine? Why are women so masculine? It's like, well, you created a society saying that all the things that are associated with being feminine are wrong, and then you wonder why women aren't doing that. Candace Owens actually had a statement that she made in one of her interviews with Andrew Tate, where if this isn't like one of the biggest pick-me-girl moments of all time, like, she just takes the cake with this one, where she stated in this interview that everything that's wrong with the society today is women's fault, feminism's fault, that women are, I forget her exact wording, but it was like women are too irrational and too emotional, and that she has the rationale to see that. Like, she has the rationale to see what's going on and what's happening, and how, you know, it's the women of the world that have destroyed everything. Like, this is her, I'm like paraphrasing what she said, but like, that's essentially what she was getting at. If you look up her interview with Andrew Tate, it was her original one, not her second one, but her first one. She's literally bashing women as a woman, and then basically being like, but I'm one of the good ones. She's arguing that women are emotional and irrational, but she's rational. So she's admitting that she's more like a man in her world and her perspective. When I say Candace Owens is masculine, I want to make it clear, she's essentially selling you on that. right? Because she's not one of those emotional women that operates from her feelings. This is her words. This is her perspective here. And again, I don't know what she's like in her personal life. I'm going by what she's like in her professional life. And again, a woman being masculine in her professional life is normal and common, and it's how most women have to operate in the world if you are going to have a professional career. So I'm not shaming that. However, I don't like the prevailing mentality, and I went into this in my video about the masculine pick-me girl. I don't like the mentality of the woman who is trying to support men being masculine and say that men have to be masculine and that women have to be more feminine, but then they're shaming anything that is associated with being feminine and saying that men are better, and then you have these women who are saying that women should be feminine and men should be masculine, but the woman is actually embodying a lot of masculine energy and almost bragging about the fact that she's different. She's not this emotional, irrational woman just operating from her feelings. She's rational and logical, but yet it's the masculine that's rational and logical, and it's the feminine that's emotional and has feelings. So she's arguing that women should be feminine, but she's also arguing that she's masculine, but shaming women for being too masculine and not being their feminine. But yet the problem with the world is women who act feminine. Have I lost you? Because I don't even know what I just said right there, but like, I don't understand the mental gymnastics that have to happen in order for people to have these perspectives. That's where, for me, it starts to feel very inauthentic, because I don't believe she's so dumb that she doesn't understand what she's saying. And she even actually mentioned in her interview that she did with George, her husband, she did make a statement at one point that I was kind of shocked that she even left that in, about how sometimes when she's talking about a topic, she's just talking to work things out in her own mind. I was like, wait a second, are you actually admitting that you just come on camera with your following and your influence and you're just talking things out off the top of your head? Which I don't really believe that's actually what she's doing. I think she's much more planned out and calculated than that, but I'm thinking it's so weird that she's making it like she's kind of almost discrediting herself. I'm not here to judge. Like, I put on a camera and I have things in my head that I know I want to talk about and talking points, but a lot of it is talking as I go. But to a certain extent, when you have a following and an influence at the level that she has, like, I would argue there's a certain responsibility to what you're saying and what that influence is on people. And I know a lot of people will have debates about that and argue about that, but I think there should be a certain sense of responsibility with how you show up and what you say. Also, I find it really interesting in some of Candace Owens' interviews with Andrew Tate, which I'll get into some of that hypocrisy in a minute, but some of the things that she said in that interview, well, actually in both of the interviews, where they talked a lot about masculinity and the concept of masculinity in society, which very much falls under the stereotypes of masculinity. I would not consider Andrew Tate a masculine man. I don't think he embodies masculinity. I think he's actually a con man. There were a lot of things that she talked about in her interview with Andrew Tate that were perspectives that Candace Owens either herself said or Andrew Tate said, and Candace Owens seemed to be backing up. Then when she had the interview where she sat down with her husband, it seemed like she was saying something different. For example, when Candace Owens and Andrew Tate were speaking, they were talking about the concept of that there's people in society that don't think that Andrew Tate should be the model of masculinity. I'd be one of those people. He shouldn't be the model. And Candace Owens was like, well, if not him, then who? And she said, well, some people say Jordan Peterson. And Andrew Tate made some quip about, well, like, if we go to war, do you want some philosopher talking about this stuff? That Candace Owens kind of laughed at that, and they kind of had this idea of like Jordan Peterson isn't really masculine because he's not fighting in war and he's not like a tough guy that physically fights like Andrew Tate, and that's the definition of masculinity, which I find fascinating because Candace Owens and Andrew Tate had this conversation of kind of like Jordan Peterson shouldn't be the model of masculinity because he's not like a tough guy. But then Candace Owens has referenced several times in her conversations with Andrew Tate about how masculine her husband was and how much she was attracted to her husband because he was so masculine. When I gotta be honest, in the conversations with George Farmer, who is Candace Owens' husband, he gives a very Jordan Peterson vibe. Not as outgoing. I think Jordan Peterson is somebody who like really likes the spotlight and he likes to be the center of attention and is more comfortable being a public figure and things like that. I'm not necessarily saying in that sense. I think he's more outgoing than, say, George Farmer is. But they're both very much intellectuals. Like, they're very much people who are more about thinking and learning in the mind and things like that. George Farmer does not come across as somebody who is just like a tough guy who's gonna like, you know, beat up somebody. And I'm not saying he wouldn't protect his family or anything like that, but like his vibe is much more of the intellectual type. So I find it kind of interesting that when Candace Owens is having a conversation with like say an Andrew Tate about masculinity, and they very much kind of like discredit the intellectual side of masculinity for the like sort of almost physical violent side of masculinity, but then she touts her husband as being masculine when he's much more of a mental version of masculinity. I'll kind of get into my analysis of his masculinity in a minute, but for me, it feels hypocritical. Candace Owens also mentioned a few times in her conversations with Andrew Tate about, you know, she did say she was dating guys when she was younger that were much more liberal, and she felt like they couldn't defend her because they weren't manly enough. She keeps using the term straight homosexual, which personally I think is very offensive, so I'm not, because I've known some guys who were gay who were much tougher than some straight men. So, you know, personally, when I talk about this stuff, sexuality is not really a factor. I tend to talk about things from more of a heterosexual perspective because that's my perspective, but like these energetics and stuff very much apply to people of any sexuality. So that really doesn't have anything to do with it. I just take a more heterosexual perspective because it simplifies it for the terminology, and I also think it's just more, it's more common, and especially because we are talking about, I would question Andrew Tate's sexuality, but that's the whole other conversation. But we are talking about people who are openly straight, so that's why I'm sticking with the heterosexual terms. But Candace Owens has very frequently referenced the fact that when she met her husband, he was so masculine and she was attracted to that, and that he knew how to hunt. That was kind of what she kept going to, is that he knew how to hunt, and that was his like defining masculine characteristic. But you can be a man who hunts and you can be in masculine or feminine energy, in the same way that you can be a woman who bakes and you could do it from a masculine or feminine place. That does not define your energy, like just the activity that you're doing. But I also want to point out that she's married to a wealthy British aristocrat. And in England, hunting is a common sport, but it's like a sport. Like they get all dressed up and like they like release the hounds and they have a fox or a pheasant or something or whatever. And it's a very kind of like upscale activity. Whereas like in America, hunting is a bit different, where you get guys like all in camo that are like sitting in a ditch waiting for a deer. Like, so I feel like the concept of hunting from a cultural perspective varies, right? That's a whole other conversation. But again, Candace Owens was really hung up on the concept that her husband knew how to hunt, and that's what made him masculine. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't define a man's masculinity because they know how to hunt. I mean, you know, I really don't love these sort of like stereotypes. And at one point in the conversation, Candace Owens made some comment about how she knew how to grow vegetables and he knew how to hunt, so if like, you know, apocalypse happened or something like that or whatever, their family would be fine. I just did a quick Google search, so I don't know how accurate this is as far as numbers go, but it's estimated that her husband is worth about $250 million and that Candace Owens is worth between $1 and $5 million. I would be shocked if she's actually specifically growing vegetables. Maybe she is, maybe that's her hobby. I have no idea. I have a hard time believing that that's true while also running a business and having 3 kids and all this kind of stuff. I don't know, but my guess is if the world starts coming to an end, it's not going to be because you can live off the land that they're going to be okay. They're going to be okay because they're in a very good financial position, and she married into money, and that's why they're going to be in a good financial position. So like, let's not pretend that it's because you guys are so good at living off the land. Still in her conversations with Andrew Tate, it's probably pretty clear in other videos I've done that I'm not a fan of Andrew Tate. I am a fan of boys having healthy masculine leadership. I think he's a horrible example of that, and I know she made the argument in one of the conversations they had about like who's a better leader. I mean, I gotta be honest, I have a hard time finding them, hard time finding a name that I think is a good healthy masculine role model, because we have such a lack of them in society. I don't think we should choose a terrible one just because there aren't any others, because I think that's possibly even worse than not having any at all. I also find it very ironic that in those conversations, and in many conversations, she brings up Hollywood and their pedo tendencies, considering Andrew Tate is what he's on trial for and what he's being accused of. Also too, I will talk a little bit about religion in a bit, but I just want to touch on the fact that, you know, Candace Owens, again, a lot of her perspectives that she throws out are, you know, anti-human trafficking, anti-pedophiles, you know, trying not to say words that are going to get this video blocked, all these things, but yet she'll associate with someone like Andrew Tate, who is being accused and has actually confessed to some of these things. He's denying it now, but like, you know, this is somebody who's associated with a lot of the things that she is speaking out against, that she's upset about. I don't justify it from anybody, but it does feel very hypocritical for her to be associating with somebody that is essentially, you know, on trial for the things that she is openly speaking out about. It's giving a very, like, I'm upset when people do it that I want to take down, but I'll look the other way when people that I want to be associated with are doing it. Also, I'm just going to toss this out there, and I'm going to get into Candace Owens and her husband and religion and stuff in a bit, but you know, Candace Owens recently converted to Catholicism because her husband is a devout Catholic, and I was raised Catholic, so I have a little bit of knowledge about the Catholic religion. The fact that Candace Owens is so hung up on the Hollywood and P-files that are, you know, involved in that, and it's not like the Catholic Church doesn't have some issues with that and some history of that, and I think it gives enough inconsistencies in her perspective to start to kind of chip away at the trustworthiness, to start to chip away at the belief that she's being authentic, because it starts to feel like she's making whatever argument seems convenient for her, get the most views or get the most clicks, or to get a certain type of audience or things like that. And it starts to chip away at the authenticity. There's also the aspect with someone like Candace Owens where, and this is a big trend, and it's not just her that does this by any means. Andrew Tate did this consistently in the interview that they did. I also find it really interesting that Andrew Tate and Candace Owens have criticized Taylor Swift quite a bit, and Taylor Swift does the same thing. This is a very common, and I believe it's probably a marketing or manipulation or some kind of tactic that people are using. It's very common. People are presenting themselves to the public as both the hero and the victim. It's a huge victimhood mentality thing, and I think it's partly a marketing tactic, because if you can paint yourself as the victim, you get people to kind of fight for you because you become the martyr. Andrew Tate has, I'll give him credit for this, I think it's horribly manipulative. He does it well, so I'll give him credit for it, even though I don't think it's a good thing. He has this way of presenting himself as like the top G. You know, he's the top G. He's, you know, the greatest thing in the world. He's this masculine man. He's the epitome of masculinity, and he's blah, 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 and that's what he paints to you. But he's also the victim. He's the victim because he's the most attacked person on the internet, according to him. Like, everybody's after him. Like, he has to keep his life private because too many people are targeting him. Too many people are after him because he's the victim. He's a tough guy. Like, he's a tough guy. I mean, he's the guy that will fight because he's the masculine man. But yet somehow he's the victim of society. Like, he's the victim of everything. A lot of these men that claim to be masculine are somehow victims of feminism. It's like, well, okay, but if you are the masculine hero, how are you also the victim? Like, if you can't be the hero and the victim at the same time. But so many people in society have used that as a marketing tactic. He does that, and look, I'll give the flip side to that. Taylor Swift, she does that and she's amazing at it. Nobody owns being the most successful victim in the world other than Taylor Swift. She's literally the top celebrity. She probably is, you know, she's the top of the music game. I know people are trying to say Beyonce is, but Taylor Swift is really the top of the music game. She's, you know, had the highest grossing tour of all time. Like, you know, Taylor Swift is at the top. I mean, she's surpassed all the male artists in the industry. I mean, she's a groundbreaking, successful female artist. But yet, there's always this underlying, like, well, I had to do this Eras tour and make all this money because somebody took my music rights. I had to, like, re-record all my music, so I'm the victim in this. And I understand how it's inspirational. People love a redemption story. People love a downfall story even more, so you know, be careful with that. And I'm not here to bash Taylor Swift or anything like that. I love her music. I love listening to her, so I'm not bashing this. She's made some amazing art from this whole experience, so, but I am pointing out that she has been really great at being this unbelievably successful woman, yet also being able to play the victim. Andrew Tate does the same thing. He does the same thing. He has managed to get all of this money and fame and success and try to convince everybody that he's the most masculine man in the world, but also that he's the most hated man in the world and that he's the most attacked man in the world. And like, it's this idea of being so successful, but also playing the victim. And, you know, Candace Owens had the big falling out with Ben Shapiro, with the Daily Wire. Not familiar with that conflict. I don't even really know a ton about that conflict, but essentially Ben Shapiro is a political commentator. He runs the Daily Wire. Candace Owens was working for the Daily Wire, and they had a big falling out. And it's interesting how she is constantly saying she was fired. Like, she's constantly harping on, like, anytime anybody says, like, well, you know, since, you know, you parting ways with the Daily Wire or something like that, she's like, well, I was fired. Like, she's constantly harping on that she was fired, in that way of reminding everybody that, like, she's the victim. And Ben Shapiro's a lawyer by trade, so his discussions of that conversation have all been very, like, lawyery, very legally. But it is interesting how Candace Owens always has to kind of, like, remind people that she's the victim. She was fired, she's the victim. And when she was having conversations with her husband particularly, or in some other things, she kept talking about how she had to deal with the backlash of being vilified, of having this be a public scandal and it being her being vilified. I gotta be honest, and this might just be, you know, because I know the internet will show you the same thing when you watch something, and they show you the same thing and whatever. So, you know, the algorithms on the, you know, social media and stuff like that, you know, show you things a certain way. But I gotta be honest with you, the overwhelming attitude that I saw was that people were blaming Ben Shapiro for firing Candace Owens and accusing him of not supporting her freedom of speech, which he's always stood by the fact that he believes in her freedom of speech and he's not trying to censor her or quiet her. He just, as a publisher, does not believe that he should be paying somebody for speech that he doesn't believe in or want to represent. Whatever your views on that, I'm a big freedom of speech person, but whatever your views on that are, you know, is what it is. It's kind of amazing. She's talked about, you know, the prevailing attitude of, like, her being painted as the bad guy and almost as if there was some kind of a smear campaign against her. I saw nothing but positive responses to her leaving and negative responses to Ben Shapiro. There might have been others, but the sentiment that I saw online of the people that were commenting about it was overwhelmingly that they were upset with Ben Shapiro for firing her. We don't really know what happened behind the scenes, but that she was the one that was gaining the support. She was already a public figure. She had a public image. In her interview with her husband, George Farmer, she talked about how, you know, they had to scramble, how difficult it was. They had to scramble to figure out, you know, how to put a podcast together, as if she had to kind of, like, start from scratch and build something on her own, which is kind of ridiculous because she already had a following. She already had her name out there. She had been in the public eye and everything for so long, and the fact that she's playing this whole she was fired, she didn't know what to do, she was trying to figure out what she was gonna do with her family and her conversations with her husband about that, and I'm like, your husband is worth $250 million. You're worth a couple $1 million. You getting fired is not, you're not gonna be able to feed your family. It's not the end of the world. And the idea that she's playing this victimhood, she's playing up the fact that she was fired. And the thing that I find ironic about that is if there was ever another woman who was claiming to be the victim of something, who was coming forward and saying that they were actually the victim of something, it's people in, maybe her or people in her space, that are the first person to criticize the victimhood mentality, to criticize the fact that people are saying that they're victims, or, you know, that people should get out of this victimhood mentality, or everything that people do is their own fault and things like that. But they're willing to play the victim. She's trying to get people to not trust celebrities and not worship celebrities, and she's so anti-celebrity and celebrity culture, yet she's using the same tactics to get people to kind of, like, worship her and follow her, and she's using these same tactics. She's criticizing celebrities for doing it. And again, I don't really think anybody on the internet, myself included, should be followed blindly, for sure. But it is just kind of interesting when you have that kind of hypocrisy that kind of comes up. I find it very interesting in the conversation that Andrew Tate had with Candace Owens, and they referenced Taylor Swift, and Andrew Tate made kind of a joke, and I've heard some other, like, red pillars and things like that make jokes about Taylor Swift's eggs drying up. And granted, Candace Owens didn't say that, but she laughed at that as if she was kind of supporting that message. Candace Owens and Taylor Swift are the same age. They were both born in 1989. Candace Owens has just had, like, 3 kids in the last 4 years. We don't know if Taylor Swift wants to have kids or not. I know everybody's got these theories that they believe that Taylor does, and blah, 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 and Travis is gonna be the one that does that, whatever, like, we don't know. But the concept in this red pill manosphere space where women's eggs dry up at 25 is insane, because there's so many women in that space, like a Candace Owens, that have kids and had those kids past 30. It's so judgmental when you have this space that's like, well, you know, as soon as a woman gets past 25, she's hit the wall and her eggs have dried up or whatever. But yet, there are women in this space who literally have had children in their 30s, you know? And I don't know if Candace Owens is done having kids or not. Like, not my business at all if she is or not. I don't care. I don't care if Taylor Swift has kids or if she doesn't. I think it's, for every woman, it's a personal choice. But I just find it so ironic that you have this man who will make a crack about a 35-year-old woman having her eggs dried up to a 35-year-old woman who has just recently had 3 babies. And she'll laugh at that and act like that's a funny thing, like, haha, yeah, this woman's eggs are drying up, when it's like, well, doesn't that mean yours are too? Yeah, it's the hypocrisy. It's the hypocrisy, and it's that kind of hypocrisy that just, again, it deteriorates the trust. I'll see people in the comments of Candace Owens' videos saying that Candace Owens is so feminine. It's like, no, she's just pretty and puts herself together well. That has nothing to do with her being feminine. She's very masculine in her content. And again, I'm not shaming or judging that by any means. Like, that's how she's presenting herself to the world. She's giving, you know, she's giving opinions and perspectives, but she's, you know, an educated woman. She's talking from her mind. She's presenting herself as very masculine, and I'm not shaming that or judging that by any means. I'm not the one that's saying it's wrong for a woman to be masculine. I do find it interesting that she touts that her husband is so masculine. Now, in order for that to work, when she's with her husband, she would have to connect to her feminine, because masculine repel. This isn't a sexuality thing or gender thing. This is an energetic thing. So two masculines are going to repel, two feminines are going to repel sexually. I mean, you can be two masculines can be friends, two feminines can be friends. Sexually, like sexual attraction, you're going to need a masculine and a feminine. In order for them to be drawn together, she would have to be very much in her feminine when she was with her husband. If her husband is in his masculine, she would really have to shift out of that masculine in her professional life to a more feminine energy in order for a masculine man to be attracted to her. That's just basic sexual polarity. Doesn't mean it's wrong for her to be in masculine energy. It means she can never be in masculine energy, but if you want to have a sexual attraction with your partner, you need a masculine and a feminine. It's not about gender roles. It's not about stereotypes. It's just about energetics. It is interesting how, you know, it's hard to know what they're like in their personal life. I do think that Candace Owens, in her conversations with her husband, there are hints at her feminine side in those conversations. It's difficult because, like, in the interview that Candace Owens did with her husband, she's the one leading the interview because it's her interview on her platform and she's the interviewer, she's the host. So she is taking the lead in the conversation, but that's the role that she's in. So, you know, she is embodying more masculine energy in that dynamic, but that's what's called for in that space. And they're obviously not in that space looking to sexually polarize with each other. So I'm not someone who, like, I'm not of the belief that a couple has to constantly be in sexual polarity in order for it to work. I mean, if you want to maintain a sexual attraction, you're gonna need to be able to spend an awful lot of time in that sexual polarity of one partner being the masculine and one partner being the feminine. But I don't think that it needs to be a constant thing. There are times when you're both gonna have to be in masculine energy, times when you're both gonna have to be in feminine energy, or, you know, variations as such. Like, I believe these things are a little bit more dynamic than, you know, a very static thing. So, you know, in that conversation with Candace Owens and her husband, she is taking the lead more, but that is kind of her role in that space. There were hints in that conversation at her feminine side when she talked about them meeting and she talked about their whirlwind romance. He proposed after 18 days, which I'll get into in a minute, but that's a little sketchy to me. She does talk about it as being a rom-com. She describes England as being very Jane Austen. Like, she does soften a little bit at points, which lead me to believe that maybe she does have a connection to her feminine energy. She actually asked her husband at one point about being married to her, and he made some statement about how, you know, I get a different person each day. I never know what I'm gonna get because there's so many different sides to Candace and stuff. That's more masculine feminine dynamics. For women, we tend to be very multifaceted. The feminine is very multifaceted. The feminine is kind of always shifting and changing and responding to the environment and responding to the senses and responding to, you know, like the feminine is very dynamic, it's very flowy, whereas the masculine tends to be more static and straight line. So that indicates to me that they have a little bit more of a masculine feminine dynamic in their personal life, because that's how he seems to be perceiving their relationship. I do find it interesting though that, you know, in Candace's conversations with Andrew Tate and her kind of like stereotypical view of masculinity, she kind of touts the idea of, like, you know, men fighting, or men, you know, being the strong protectors, or, you know, men hunting and her husband hunts and stuff like that, and how that's her definition of masculine energy. I actually think that her husband George embodies a lot of masculine energy, but not because of those things, and maybe he does those things, I don't know. I mean, I you know, just seeing him in this one particular interview, it's hard to know. But I would say that he embodies a lot more masculine energy because he's more of the mind. He's very thinking, he's very intellectual, he's obviously a scholar, he thinks about things a lot. It's very clear he's not that comfortable being on camera, but when topics that he is very knowledgeable about come up, he seems much more able to talk about them, and he seems much more excited to talk about them, as if he has a very defined passion and purpose, which is, to me, the defining characteristic of a masculine man is having a very distinct passion and purpose, which is kind of interesting because his version of masculine energy is a little contradictory to the sort of manosphere attitude of masculinity. I would argue that his masculine energy, again, it's a passion and purpose. In his case, it happens to be religion, which, you know, is polarizing for a lot of people, but in his case, his religion seems to be it seems to be his passion. I mean, I would actually make the argument that some of the most masculine men you're gonna find are like monks that dedicate their entire life to just sitting in silence, having a direct focus. So I actually think that George seems to embody a little bit more masculine energy than a lot of the guys in the manosphere space, because he does seem to have such a focused passion and purpose. At least this is the way it came across in the interview. And it's interesting how in some instances when he was talking about Candace having opinions about things, and you know, I don't want to get into too many like controversial topics because this isn't about politics or anything. There were certain topics that like she would bring up, like, what are your views on vaccines? Like he said, in England, that's not a conversation. So for him, it was just kind of like, I don't know what, you know, like he said something about, you might as well just ask me what I think of Tuesday. It happens. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. I think that there's kind of an attitude in the manosphere that for a man to be masculine, he has to have a very distinct opinion about everything. And he has to push his opinion about everything onto everybody else. And to lead a household or to be the leader or whatever, you have to have a strong opinion about everything, and you have to push that opinion on everybody else. That's not really masculine. That's actually more narcissistic. The masculine, generally speaking, is going to have more of a focus and have more of a distinct purpose, to the point where there's gonna be a lot of things in life that are just not gonna kind of be on his radar, because he gets so laser focused on the things that matter in that moment. So he's not gonna be the guy that's going to be constantly wanting to deal with all kinds of little details of things that aren't necessarily as important to him. So like, that's where I think you get a lot of women who are like, well, I just want my husband's opinion about what kind of curtains I should have. He doesn't want to give the opinion. Now, granted, if a man chooses to be in a relationship and something is important to his partner, he should be giving her presence and attention and things like that. I'm not using this as an excuse for men to just neglect their partner or anything like that. But generally speaking, a man who is a masculine man with a distinct passion and purpose is not going to want to be sitting there and debating with his wife about what kind of curtains they should have, because he's going to be focused on something else. He's going to have a distinct purpose, which is oftentimes a conflict with a lot of women who say they want a masculine man, but they don't realize that that masculine man is going to have a passion and purpose that is not going to make it so that he's going to be spending a ton of time with her, focused on a lot of like little decisions in life. That's just the masculine feminine dynamic thing. That's not to say that if you do have a masculine man and, you know, he does have a distinct passion and purpose, that he shouldn't take time to be present with you. And like, it's not excusing a man being neglectful or anything. A masculine man is just not a man that like comes home and throws his weight around and throws his opinions around, and it's just like, well, I want this and I want that and we're gonna make this happen and whatever. Like, that's not leadership, really. That's just somebody that just wants to push their weight around and prove that they're more important. A masculine man is going to be more focused on a distinct passion and purpose. He should have presence with you. You know, it's not to say that as a woman in your partnership that he shouldn't make you an important part of his life and that he shouldn't nurture that relationship, but his passion and purpose and his focus is going to be number one. That can be difficult because for a woman, when a woman embodies her feminine energy, relationship is going to be number one. If she does have a passion and purpose, that will fall second, which is why, if you think about it, for women, oftentimes when it comes to issues with family or your children or something, like, they'll drop work to focus on the relationship because that's what they feel like is their highest priority. Whereas for men, unfortunately, if you have a masculine man, he will tend to be more likely to neglect the family for his passion and purpose. That does not excuse men for neglecting the family for like cheap thrills. That's a totally different conversation. But men are a little bit more likely to not give as much attention and focus to relationships because they're focused on distinct passion and purpose. Not saying that either of this is an excuse to like neglect a certain part of your life or anything. It's just that typically men are going to focus on their passion and purpose first, and relationships are going to come second, whereas the feminine is going to focus on relationships first, and the passion and purpose will come after that. And one of the problems, if you think about it, right, if you have two masculine partners and they're both focused on passion and purpose, no one's focused on the relationship. If you have two people that are just focused on relationship, it's gonna start to feel too clingy and too needy. Usually at least one of you, if not both of you, is gonna start to feel like, oh my God, I need something outside the relationship, because it's gonna start to feel too clingy. That's like a gross generalization of a much deeper topic. I have other videos that go into the masculine feminine polarity and things like that, but that's just kind of a brief summary. Candace Owens and her husband do come from very different backgrounds. Candace Owens grew up in the United States. Her words said she's from the wrong side of the tracks, whereas George Farmer grew up in the UK from a very wealthy family. I'm not somebody who believes that people from different cultures can't make a relationship work. I do know that Candace Owens has gotten some criticism for marrying a white man as a black woman. She even references in the interview with her husband that she got a lot of criticism because people said that her marrying a white man was bad for her brand. I don't have any issue with interracial relationships. I believe in compatibility. I think, you know, I don't believe that any of the stuff I talk about as far as energetics of, you know, masculine feminine dynamics has anything to do with race at all. And I think that people from two different cultures and stuff can make things work. However, I would always advise people, in general, to take your time to get to know people. And I think that's especially true when you have two people that come from different backgrounds, because you really want to make sure that you two are on the same page before moving forward with your relationship. Supposedly the story behind Candace Owens and her husband's marriage was that he proposed to her after knowing her for 18 days. They had never been on a date and they'd never even kissed. I know they'd had conversations in that time. I just don't believe that in 18 days you can really know enough about a person to make the decision to spend the rest of your life with them, especially when you have two people that come from different cultural backgrounds. So I think you need more time than that to make sure that the two of you are on the same page about a lot of issues. You know, granted, they didn't get married immediately, but they did get married relatively quickly after the proposal. So, you know, maybe they did take the time in that time to really get to know each other and be on the same page. I hope that they did. And I hope that their relationship works out. They talk about it being fate. It's very interesting how particularly George, who is very religious and they're very Catholic, will talk about their relationship as if it was fate and things had to be in alignment for it to happen, which sounds very much like kind of the spirituality world. It sounds very much like the exact same terminology and language that people who weren't necessarily religious but were more spiritual, or who were into astrology or believed in soulmates or things like that. I find it interesting how much overlap there is between very religious people, like people who are very into organized religion, and people that are more into spirituality. They don't like to like each other very much. They'll have their judgments as to like that their way is right, but yet there's a lot of overlap between different types of beliefs when it comes to these things, you know, spiritually, that a lot of people don't want to acknowledge. Like if somebody had said to these two that, you know, they believed it was written in the stars and that they were soulmates or something like that, they very likely would be like, well, yeah, but it wasn't biblical or something like that. Whereas, you know, people who are more religious will believe that, you know, it was divine intervention or it was Christ or something like that or whatever. And when at the end of the day, it's really just whatever faith you believe in is what you're believing is the reason why you're together. I find it interesting how the terminology in those situations tends to overlap. Now, a man embodying his masculine energy, generally speaking, is not going to be somebody that's going to be jumping to impulsive decisions, particularly if it's somebody who is very masculine of the mind, like somebody who's more of an intellectual. And I do feel like very much that George's perspective on this was almost like there was no romance to it. It was a very rational decision, which I guess you could say is a very masculine idea. But the masculine is not typically one to jump into relationships or jump into a decision of something like marriage quickly. The masculine mind is not going to tend to like the distractions of that. So the fact that he proposed so quickly, I find a little suspicious. And the fact that she accepted so quickly, and I know like they've both said that they believe it was like it was meant by God and all this stuff, which frankly I gotta be honest with you, if some aristocrat from a really wealthy family that was worth like $250 million decided to propose to me quickly, I'd probably think it was divine intervention too. And I find it interesting how like kind of the whole manosphere thing is so into like men shouldn't get married because you can't trust women and women are only after men's money, when it's like, well, people aren't like, he's worth significantly more money than she is, but she's not painted as a gold digger that's after his money. Even though, I gotta be honest with you, when all she knew about him after 18 days was the fact that he was worth all this money. I mean, again, I'm not saying she's only with him for his money. I actually could not find, I tried Googling it. I don't know if they have a prenup or if they don't. He's worth significantly more money than her. She's pretty much set for life. She never has to work again. She's only working because she wants to. And I also find it interesting when Candace Owens was talking about some of the conspiracies about the two of them or about him, and one of the conspiracies was that he was a descendant of the Rothschilds, and she kind of fluffed it off as a joke of like, well, I mean, I'd like that to be true just for the money, when it's like, when you're with someone who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, do you really need him to be related to a family that's worth even more than that? Like, how much is your lifestyle going to change if you were related to somebody who was worth $1 billion when you already are married to somebody who's worth a couple $100 million? Like, I realize that the billionaire lifestyle and the millionaire lifestyle is different, but when you're with someone who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, especially if you're somebody who's bragging about the fact that you would be fine living off the land because he can hunt and you can grow vegetables, how much is your life going to change if you were married to somebody worth that much money? And I know she was probably making a joke, and I get that and everything, but it's just interesting how we're not painting her as being the gold digger, even though he's worth significantly more money than she is, but she's not painted as the gold digger. Now, she works. That's one of my issues with the fact that she's constantly criticizing feminism and diminishing women that put their career first when she has a career. Yes, she has kids. I'm sure she has help. I'm sure with that much money and access to whatever she would need, she has help, I'm sure. I don't like the idea that women who have careers make a career out of criticizing women for putting their career first and criticizing feminism when the only reason why you have a career to criticize feminism is because of feminism. Like, as that comes out of my mouth, I'm like, I can't believe that that's even something that needs to be said, but whatever. Yeah, it's just kind of interesting how, again, they're kind of painting themselves, like she said about, you know, like, well, I got fired and we had to scramble and get things going, and it's like, did you really? Because you don't have to work. She touts the idea of sort of this traditional values and traditional relationship where technically as a woman you shouldn't be working anyway. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that's kind of the mentality we're talking about here. And, you know, she's kind of implying that her husband kind of dropped everything and tried to learn how to do the behind the scenes stuff to help her and this and that. It is interesting how she seems to imply that, like, her husband has now devoted a lot of his time and energy to helping her build a platform. So now he's now supporting her passion and purpose, which would make her the masculine in the relationship, because supporting somebody's passion and purpose is the feminine role and having the passion and purpose is the masculine role. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong here, but I'm just saying that, like, if he's now supposed to be dropping everything to support her passion and purpose, then that would put her in the masculine role and him in the feminine role. Also, it comes to humor in relationships. Now, George Farmer obviously has kind of a dry British wit. I love a dry British wit, to be honest with you. And I also very much appreciate couples that can laugh together, couples that can be playful with each other. I was a professional stand-up comedian for 15 years, so I very much appreciate humor. But you have to be careful with humor in a relationship, because sometimes humor is meant to be playful, and sometimes humor has an underlying level of resentment. Sometimes it's hard to tell which it is, but it's something to be aware of. Now look, because I came from a background of stand-up comedy where I was trying to write comedy, and I think people that are kind of in the public eye, that are always kind of looking to, you know, when you're a writer or a creative person, or sometimes you just say things because you know it's going to be funny and there's really no meaning behind it or something like that. Or you just want to be witty, or you want to make a joke or something like that. But sometimes humor, particularly if it's kind of like targeted at someone to chip away at them, sometimes there's a hidden meaning there that somebody's just not ready to say out loud. I think in the course of the conversation between Candace and her husband, I think they both did that a little bit, but I was noticing that when Candace did it, particularly when she talked about her husband not being quite as into his religion when they got married, and then him becoming much more Catholic, and she kind of makes, I forget her exact wording, but it was something implying that she's like, he's like maybe too Catholic now or something like that, like, and they kind of laughed it off like it was a joke. And maybe it was just a joke, but it had a slight air of like she's resenting him for how much time he's spending on his religion. She did convert recently, which I do find interesting, because in a lot of their conversation was about how deeply he had gotten into his religion and how focused he was on his religion, how much he was studying his religion. You know, he majored in theology in school, and like that was his main focus. But then the idea that they weren't the same religion when they got married, and then she converted to Catholicism relatively recently, so I think they'd already had a couple kids at that point. It seems strange to me that if he was somebody who was so deep in his religion that he wouldn't have married someone who's already in his religion, or if he did want to marry her, that she wouldn't have converted before they got married. It's kind of sounding like maybe he got away from focusing as much about religion when they got married, and then he got back into it and deeper into it after they got married. And there's something inherently wrong with that. But then she converts while they're married. But she made a few comments about that, about him going to church more often and going to confession regularly and all this kind of stuff. Her comments about that, to me, had a slight underlying resentment that he was spending time doing that. And I'm not saying that's actually how she feels, but it had a slight air of that. Maybe she was just trying to be funny and quippy, and that's a possibility. I would say that maybe there's an underlying sense of a bit of resentment that he's spending time on that. And that clearly does seem to be his passion, is religious beliefs and religious views. He majored in theology. That was his background. That I find a little bit concerning. If she is resenting him at all for his passion and purpose, that's going to be a huge issue in their relationship. And the masculine partner specifically has a distinct passion and purpose. He will only want to be with a partner that supports that passion and purpose. If he feels like his partner or anything in his life is actually deterring from his passion and purpose, he's going to start to resent it. So I think that's going to be an issue. Now, Candace Owens's connection to Andrew Tate, I've found weird from the beginning, because I think a lot of her religious views and traditional values that she's touted and things like that don't line up with somebody like an Andrew Tate. I would even theorize I think that might have been part of the behind the scenes issue with her and Ben Shapiro, because Ben Shapiro very distinctly didn't badmouth Andrew Tate. He was somewhat critical of him, but was always very careful of what he said about Andrew Tate until relatively recently, and he seems to be much more vocal about not being in favor of Andrew Tate's lifestyle now. And I find it interesting that he didn't do that until Candace Owens was done and gone. I think Andrew Tate has more influence over a lot of stuff that's going on than we're even privy to, and I find that concerning. Both Andrew Tate and George Farmer, I believe in the research that I've done, and maybe there's more out there that I haven't seen, they seem to be very sort of vague about what their connection to each other is. Supposedly they go way back. They've known each other for a long time, but they seem to be very vague about that. I believe, George Farmer has made it clear that he, has known Andrew Tate for a long time, but they don't agree on everything and things like that, which is always possible in just two people who know each other for a long time and they get along, but they don't have the same views. That's entirely possible. But I have found it very interesting that Candace Owens, who's interviewed Andrew Tate now twice, does really pander to him when she interviews him. Like, really panders to him, which I find interesting because she's not typically a pandering type. She's not someone who typically is afraid of confrontation. She's very confrontational in many instances. Her pandering to him I find somewhat odd. In Candace Owens' most recent interview she did with Andrew Tate, she tells a story that I find it hard to believe. I really don't believe it, and I almost started to feel like this was an infomercial for Andrew Tate's Hustlers University, because Candace Owens made some reference to having an employee that was so great, it was the most wonderful employee, and then she asked him, like, where did you go to school, like expecting him to say like one of these like fancy universities like Harvard or Yale or something like that. Like, I'm paraphrasing. He said Hustlers University, and she was all like, what's that? As if she had no idea what that was, and then found out that it was like Andrew Tate's like online school, and they get into this whole thing about like he's trying to replace colleges, and Candace Owens was talking about how great this was, and that this was such a great employee, and then obviously like Andrew Tate is producing these amazing employees and future employees and entrepreneurs coming from Hustlers University. I feel like this had to have been a paid endorsement that was not disclosed, because for one, if this was an employee of hers, how did she not know on their resume where they went to school? She hired an employee and she didn't see a resume, so she knew where their education came from. And you can't tell me that somebody who pays attention to pop culture and what's going on the internet and that knows Andrew Tate, because her husband knows Andrew Tate, didn't know that Hustlers University was Andrew Tate's school, and didn't at the very least know this was a thing. It seemed way too, I'm pretending to be shocked by this. And then maybe this guy was a great employee. If this guy exists, I don't know. It seemed very fake to me. My guess is he's not a great employee because he went to Hustlers University. I've actually never heard any positive reviews about Hustlers University from people that, when I was trying to look up reviews, most people have said it's an overpriced thing. Once you get into it, it's very hard to get out of it to not pay, but it's like, it's all information about how to do things like affiliate marketing and stuff that you can just Google how to do, and you don't need a course to do it. Maybe there's other aspects to it that are better, I don't know. I've just read reviews from people that have left, which I'm sure are biased. The idea that Andrew Tate is gonna come up with an online program that's gonna replace a college education is actually insane. They went into this whole thing about, you know, the problem with the college systems and things like that. I have a college degree, but I'll be the first person to say that I think there's a lot of problems with the college university system here in America. For sure. It's massively overpriced and people aren't necessarily getting what they're paying for, and you know, I mean, there's so many factors in this. I've been very vocal about this with a lot of people that I've talked to, is I think there's a lot of people out there, like, we push people into colleges that really don't need to go to college or shouldn't be going to college. I think actually, you know, making trade schools, which are a great option for some people, you know, can be great. Like, I mean, I have my own opinions about the college system. I think college is important for people that are going to go on a certain path, and there are great reasons for people to go to college. There's also great reasons for people not to go to college. I just find it very interesting that in this interview, and again, it was kind of like, it turned into this like infomercial for Hustlers University, but it was kind of this like anti-college, and a lot of people sort of in this conservative space have this kind of like anti-going to college for college's sake, like this anti-education for education's sake, this kind of attitude that like if you're not going to college to follow a specific career path, then college is a waste of time, and like education for education's sake is a waste of time. Now, I will agree that particularly here in America, because that's the system I'm familiar with, going to college just for education's sake financially is not really feasible at this point. And I think something needs to be done about that, but that's a whole other conversation. However, when I sit down and listen to Candace Owens talk to her husband, he's very much a scholar. He's very much an intellectual, of somebody who went to school to study theology for education's sake. He studied theology, which is something that I feel like here in America, a lot of the kind of conservative base would say, like, oh, you go to school to study philosophy or theology or, you know, women's studies or gender studies or whatever. That's just a waste of time and a waste of money and stuff. And you could argue that it may not be the best use of your money, but I just find it interesting that you have people that are kind of diminishing the concept of education for education's sake because it's a waste of time and money, but yet, you know, someone like a Candace Owens is married to a man who went to school to study for education's sake. Now, granted, he was in a situation in the UK, is probably a totally different system, and I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about it. He was in a position financially, obviously. He comes from a family with money where that's possible. I do know that Candace Owens made it very clear, as well as her husband in the interview, that they don't agree on everything. They don't have the same perspectives on everything, that they don't see eye to eye on everything, and that they don't really think that it's normal that everybody would. And honestly, I think that's healthy. You know, she also made a comment about how, you know, they both are very curious about each other, and they're very curious about other people's opinions, and, you know, aren't jumping to arguing about it and stuff, and that they just kind of generally want to know why each other thinks the way that they do and things like that. Frankly, I think it's very healthy. I think it's absolutely healthy. That's not what the manosphere trad lifestyle people are pushing. So again, they're not really like a trad wife traditional relationship kind of a couple, which I think their dynamic in that instance is quite healthy, of acknowledging that they, you know, don't believe the same things, but they still love each other and they respect each other's opinions and things. I think that's normal and healthy. But for someone like a Candace Owens, who spends a lot of time bashing feminism and says that women are to blame for everything in the world, it's usually that kind of like trad con mentality that, well, it's the man's opinion that's the only thing that matters. The man leads the household, the man makes the decisions, and his is the only opinion that matters, and the wife's not supposed to have an opinion. So like, the man's opinion is the household's opinion, and the wife wouldn't have any other opinion because she's just supposed to submit to whatever her husband's opinion is. So I find it interesting how in instances like that, it seems like Candace Owens and her husband actually have a pretty healthy relationship dynamic, at least the way they're presenting it, in that sense of, you know, they each have their own opinions and they respect that they have differing opinions about things and stuff. I'd be interested to know how they work out those conflicts when they actually affect their personal lives. George made a comment about, you know, that they saw eye to eye on the things that matter, which is important, and that's probably the best way to have a sane relationship. There was a thread, and I think this is common, and I don't want to sound like I'm judging her, because I think this is a common thing for women, because Candace Owens has a really, really strong connection to her masculine energy. And I don't say that to shame her, she does. I do feel like at times when she's dealing with George, she kind of puts herself down a little bit. Not blatantly, but there does seem to be a little bit of like her trying to diminish her masculine energy, or almost kind of forcing it into a, well, sometimes I'm just thinking out loud. I know she wants to praise him and she wants to give him credit, and I know some of it is kind of cute because he's obviously like not comfortable with taking credit for things and he's much more humble and stuff, and I kind of think it's cute when she kind of like tries to compliment him and he gets uncomfortable and stuff. I think that's kind of cute. But it does feel like she's holding herself back a little bit when she's talking about him or dealing with him, and I think that's a common thing when women have a strong connection to their masculine energy, like in their regular life. I think sometimes they have to force themselves to hold back around their masculine partner because they don't want to scare him off, which I stand by the fact that if you can emasculate a man or you can scare off a masculine man, then he's not masculine enough for you. I'm not saying that women shouldn't learn to connect to their feminine energy when they're in a relationship, if they want to be in a relationship with a masculine partner, because I think for most women that's going to feel the most natural and the most healthy. But if a woman feels like she has to hold back intentionally, that resentment is probably going to build. And it feels like every once in a while she would throw in a little almost like jab at herself, which, you know, it could just be, you know, self-deprecating humor or whatever, or something like that. But I don't know, I did feel like sometimes she was like almost trying to praise him but hold herself back, and I didn't like seeing that. But again, I'm nitpicking at this point. There's like so many other instances that I was finding that were just like conflicting, and especially in watching her interactions with some other people, especially her conversations with Andrew Tate, and then flipping back to watching the interviews with her husband and just feeling kind of really strange. Again, when Candace Owens and her husband were talking about some of the conspiracy theories, one of the conspiracy theories is that Andrew Tate has some kind of like blackmail information on, you know, George or George and Candace, and that's why she's kind of like been interviewing Andrew Tate and why she's kind of been pandering to him and stuff like that. Maybe this is my conspiracy theory mind. I don't know. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's not true. I have no clue. They were laughing at it like, oh, that was such a ridiculous conspiracy theory, but their body language was really weird. Candace's demeanor got really uncomfortable as she was trying to make that into like that's such a funny joke. I can't believe people would believe this. Her body language got weird, and she jumped to, I mean, I've only met Andrew Tate like 5 times, and she started in with this, like the 2 times she interviewed him, and then this, and she's like, okay, maybe only 4. Like, how many times she's met him doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not he would have blackmail information on her husband. It's well known, they've admitted it, that George and Andrew Tate know each other from way back. So how many times Candace Owens has met Andrew Tate has absolutely nothing to do with a blackmail situation or whether or not that's true or whether it's not. So it seems strange that like she's jumping to something that has nothing to do with the actual topic. And I'm not saying he is or he isn't, but it's just, it was a very odd reaction to it. It made me kind of like, I feel like they're trying to discredit this, but it almost made me think it was more true because she got awkward about it. But it's also too, like, if he's friends with Andrew Tate, and like I've seen interviews with George Farmer where he's talked about having conversations with Andrew Tate and all this kind of stuff as if they're kind of old friends, but then he's married to Candace Owens. Why has she only met Andrew Tate like 5 times or 4 times or whatever? And then again, the fact that she was trying to go with 5 times and then it was like, oh, maybe it's only 4. It's like she was holding back, not wanting to admit one of the times. I don't know. It just was a weird response. And I find it funny because it's like, she brought it up. Like, she brought up the conspiracy as something that they were gonna try to discredit, and then it almost made me believe it more after she said it, because I do think that her interactions with Andrew Tate were weird because they seem to point out a lot of hypocrisy in her life or things she believes, and she definitely panders to him. It just seemed weird. It led me to think that there's something more going on there that we're not privy to. I touched on their quick engagement before. Knew each other for 18 days and never really had a date or anything. George has said there was no romance to it. It was not romantic at all, which, you know, to a certain extent in the masculine mind, making that decision from a practical standpoint. They've never really given a specific reason as to what the practical standpoint was. I feel like there's something more to that. I don't know if like he really wanted to come to America and this was his chance. If there was some kind of there's something more to that. There's something more to this conversation that they're skating over and not telling us. I feel like there's more. And again, they're allowed to have privacy for sure. I mean, they're allowed to keep some things private, but there's something more to it. Especially somebody who, for him himself, having a lot of money and coming from a family with a lot of money, having a quick, like, you know, proposing quickly to an American woman he's just met, I feel like there has to be something more to that. Like, really wealthy families are much more hell-bent on protecting their money and things like that. Like, there's something else going on in that situation, and I don't really know specifically what it is. But the quick proposal and engagement, I see a lot of people every time they talk about this, or, you know, it's a video about this, whether she tells a story or whether it's them telling the story or something, I always get people in the comments that I notice that will say things like, you know, well, I met my husband and 2 weeks later he proposed. When a man knows, he knows. And I've talked about the idea of, like, when a man knows, he knows in other videos, because oftentimes he's not choosing from his brain, he's choosing for other reasons. I've had guys comment that, like, they knew right away that they wanted to marry their wife, but, like, they still took the time to get to know each other because he wanted her to be comfortable and not have her feel like he was rushing her, which I think is probably the healthiest scenario. I'm in no way advocating that you should be sitting around and waiting for a man for years to figure out what he wants. Like, I don't advocate that at all. But when a man claims that he just knows, like, super quickly, as a woman, I think you need to kind of, like, you need to be the one to slow it down and be like, okay, does he really know? Because he can't really know me in that time. And I'll see people that will say, like, you know, well, I was engaged after only 2 weeks and we've been together for 20 years or whatever, which, first of all, longevity in a marriage will never be proof for me that you have a healthy marriage. Because I've known people who've been married for like 50 years and they're the most miserable people ever, but they're still married. So I don't believe in longevity as being a sign that a marriage is healthy. Can it work if you meet and get engaged quickly? Can it work out? Yes. Can it go really wrong? Yes. I just did a video recently on the hot topic that everyone was talking about that the new trophy wife, who was an online content creator, married a guy after a week and he ended up abusing her and their children. So many people are like, you shouldn't have married him after a week. You shouldn't have rushed into it. You shouldn't have married him after a week. You didn't have time to get to know him. But yet you have another couple who says that they got engaged after 18 days and people are like, oh my God, they just knew it was fate. And does it work out sometimes? Yes. Does it not work out sometimes? Yes. I know there are some people that are going to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to do what feels right. And if it works out, great. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The reality is, I know there's going to be guys that are going to argue with me about this, but the reality is that women are usually the ones that end up being the most vulnerable in these situations, which is why I always advise women to take things slow, to not let a man rush you into a relationship and not get too caught up in this, like, oh, it's fate or some kind of a rom-com fairy tale, which I know is very tempting to do as a woman. Believe me, I've got plenty of fairy tale fantasies up in my head, so I get it. I've for sure been somebody that's been guilty of this. In Sex and the City terms, I'm a Charlotte, so I for sure project fantasies onto guys and then find out that they're not true. Why I speak from experience and telling women you gotta pace the relationship and take things slow and get to know a guy, get to know who he really is. Because if a guy rushes into a relationship, it might be for genuine reasons, but it could also be for a lot of really bad reasons. And as a woman, you're going to be more vulnerable in that situation. You're always going to be more vulnerable. As women, we have to protect ourselves. It's sad that we have to, because men aren't protecting us, but like, we have to. Frankly, I don't think that the risk is worth rushing into a relationship on the off chance that you might be marrying a good one. Now, I kind of get it. Where, you know, if a guy from a really wealthy family who's worth, you know, a couple $100 million is like, hey, let's rush into a relationship, I get it. I'd have a hard time saying no to that. But for your own safety, I think it's important to pace the relationship and not go into something blindly, because it can get really dangerous for women. And, you know, hoping that in Candace Owens' situation that it never gets dangerous. And I honestly hope that they have a long and happy life together, and, you know, for them and for the sake of their kids and everything. Like, I don't wish bad things on them at all. I definitely think there's some sketchy aspects to this. I definitely think that this could very easily be a business relationship, that this could be something that was contractual, that this was something that made both of them look good. I know she kind of pretended as if people were telling her it was bad for her brand, but I don't really think that it is. I think it actually might be good for her brand, to be honest with you. I know she made the comment that that wasn't a consideration when she got married. Fair enough. But I don't think that it was bad for her brand. And again, there's so many things to pick apart here. I know Candace Owens has talked many times about, you know, her husband not wanting to be on social media, not liking social media, but then you find out that he actually was trying to start Parler, which was a social media app, to try to compete with other social media apps, which ended up being a failure, which might be a failure because he's not someone who's into social media. But it does seem strange that somebody who doesn't like social media would be trying to start a social media company. The fact that there has been this kind of pattern of inauthenticity and this pattern of kind of hypocrisy and some of the perspectives and things that kind of accumulate to the point where when somebody does present you with something, you're like, I don't know what I can believe and what I can't believe. You have Candace saying that this was like a rom-com and so romantic, and then you have George kind of saying that like there was no romantic overtones, it was a very practical decision. Now, the masculine working from practicality and the feminine working from the rom-com fairy tale, not totally uncommon. But Candace Owens has also said other times that like women are so emotional and irrational, but she's the rational one. But yet she got engaged to her husband after 18 days because it was like a rom-com. It does lead people to start to think like, okay, but who are you? And again, I don't judge women for being in their masculine in their professional life and then wanting to be in their feminine in their personal life. I think that's probably healthy for most women. But it is gonna lead people to feeling like you might not be trustworthy, to feeling like there's a lack of stability there and a lack of consistency. And it's gonna signal to people that something is off. And sometimes you're not gonna know what it is. Just so you know, if you do feel like something's off and you don't know what it is, it's probably your intuition. If you're like triggered by something, if you're just sort of like angrily triggered, that's probably like your past trauma or your issues or something like that that's clouding your judgment. Doesn't mean that your intuition isn't telling you it's off. It just means that that's probably clouding your judgment, and it's probably best to work on that and then listen to your intuition. But that feeling of like something's off but I don't know what is probably your intuition talking. Please learn to listen to that, because I think if anything, if women get nothing else from this video, it is please listen to your intuition, because that's like the most important thing for women. So hopefully you got something else from this video, but if nothing else, and there's probably so many other things, I feel like I'm like forgetting a bunch of stuff because I had so many ideas floating through my head. But yeah, this was just my analysis of spending way too much time listening to Candace Owens interview Andrew Tate, and then my analysis of Candace Owens and her interview with her husband, which you can look up online if you want. I didn't use clips because of I don't want to get into copyright issues and stuff like that, but I found these interviews online very easily, so you can probably find them all online. I do have some videos coming up. I'm doing some research. I also had a lot of requests to kind of analyze Melania. I'm currently reading her book, so I'm hoping to get that video up by inauguration so we can kind of analyze her, maybe Trump's relationships with some of his wives. I touched on that in my video that I did about JD and Usha Vance, if you want to check out that video. So yeah, I'm excited about working on that analysis. I also have some exciting things coming up soon as far as content, and I'm working on stuff, so just, you know, subscribe, stay tuned. I've got some big things coming this year. I have my guided journals, my Dark Feminine Energy guided journal and my Recovering Pick Me Girl guided journal. You find yourself in kind of a pandering to men, pick me girl mentality. If you feel like you want to heal from that, be sure to check out my Recovering Pick Me Girl guided journal and my Dark Feminine Energy guided journal. Details in the description box below, along with links to my courses, masterclasses, and all my social media links. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.